Hi everyone, welcome to Love Oz YA. My name is Julia Faragher, and today I'm here with Will Kostakis to chat about his exciting new novel, We Could Be Something. Will, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat.
Amazing. So, to get us started, could you please tell us, for those who haven't read it yet, what is We Could Be Something about?
Ah, I have no idea how to talk about it yet, but basically, that's always the sort of stress of, starting a new sort of book release cycle. But basically, it's about two guys. One of them, Harvey, he's a bit of a no-hoper, aspiring high school dropout whose dads are getting divorced. And the other character, Sotiri, he is the exact opposite. He is a high school overachiever. He has just published his first book at 17. And We Could Be Something is about what happens when their stories converge on the same street in Darlinghurst in Sydney.
Amazing. So, this is a multi-generational family story in several ways. How did you approach creating all of the different characters that make up this big family?
Um, I basically looked at my life. No. um, it was it was two separate stories that I was writing, and basically, well, not writing, but sort of brainstorming. What I do is my process is usually waiting to see which idea jumps out at me the most and is so I had two competing ideas vying for my attention. The first was a middle grade novel about living in a house with a mother and a grandmother, and sort of that multi-generational sort of thing. And then slowly that became grandmother and great grandmother. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. But I didn't really know what the plot for that was. And then the other half of it was like, okay, it's been 15 years since my first book came out. I reckon I can start making fun of the people in publishing and me in publishing when I started out. And so there were these two ideas. And then I had this idea of a gay divorce, and suddenly those ideas merged together in a really nice way. And then it got to the point where after like 6 months of thinking about these two books, I was like, can these sort of merge together? And then when they did, I was like, yeah, no, this is it. This is the book. And I wasn't able to shake it. And then it just sort of snowballed from there.
That's so cool to hear that it started out as like two separate ideas that you realized suddenly, oh, these are actually the same story. But
Like,
like
yeah, I'm saying they have no business being together at all. But then as I was writing it, I was like, oh, that can feed into this in a
mm,
really interesting way. And then they're like two plants that grew beside each other. They would never have been that shape had they not grown alongside each other. But now I can't imagine them as freestanding plants, if that makes sense.
yeah, absolutely. Because like when I read the book, it felt like a very complete story. Like it didn't feel like it had started as separate things. Like it all makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like you said, Satiri in the book is a published 17-year-old author, and
Mhm.
you were also a published author at the age of 19.
Yeah,
And you
yeah.
talk in the acknowledgements of this book about how this story actually started as a memoir project.
Mhm.
So, how did it become fiction?
So for me, so it was early pandemic. I was like, okay, what am I going to do with my time? My brain felt broken, and it felt like, you know what, I want to draw a line sort of in my career. There is, when I do school visits and public events, there's a lot of sort of throwaway anecdotes of my childhood that have never really made it into a book. Like, I'm really good at sort of the absent father stuff in a novel, but I'm never really like, okay, let me really interrogate my dad and what an asshat he is. Um, and so that was going to be the aim, and it was just to sort of excise all of the personal stuff so I could start to really free myself to explore sort of fiction more freely. But I think I just have to come to terms with the fact that a big part of my process is starting with deep personal truths and then turning into something that I cannot recognize. But in those early days of the pandemic, I was like, sure, memoir, why not? Because it was all those stories that I tell when I visit schools. And so that was the stuff about sort of my Greek upbringing, my mum having a cafe, me sort of, wrestling with my sexuality, in primary school, high school. Um, and then slowly but surely, as I was sort of writing those anecdotes down, I was like, oh, like I could make this 20% spicier. It would still be believable, but then it wouldn't be my truth anymore.
Mm.
And then slowly but surely I realized, oh, wait, but if I change this, reframe this, and my brain was already doing that editorial where it was like, I'd done my first draft, which was the personal writing, but then the fictional stuff really started to elevate it. And, for me, I'm not really that precious about ever releasing a memoir. And so in this case, I was like, well, no, the better story is if it's fictionalized. I think it can have more resonance if it is fictionalized as well. Like, I think we've sort of hit critical mass in Australian publishing, especially of books set in the early 2000s where, conventionally attractive gay men are struggling with their sexuality. I'm like, you know what? Like let's park that. Like it wasn't that much of a struggle. Like it was, but like comparatively, let's not. um, and so I just felt and that's a big part of sort of what the book is discussing. It's that, there are so many authors my age and older where the time for us to tell those stories have passed. We look a bit silly when we stand up there and say, it's so difficult being gay. And it's just like, that's not the world that exists anymore. And obviously, we have to fight to make sure that that world doesn't exist again. But we're all sort of carrying these stories that actually don't resonate anymore, or that don't, like, I talk to teenagers, I'm like, hey, I was really scared to come out in high school, and they were like, why, loser? Or it'll be like, hey, in 2016 there was a concerted effort to ban me from speaking at most Catholic schools, and then because of that most other schools in Australia followed suit for about 6 months. And they're like, what? And so there's been such a huge shift that we have all of these stories now that have no place and have no audience. Like we can say, hey, this is historical fiction or whatever. But I'm really bored of how much emphasis sort of the publishing side puts on those kinds of stories at the expense of it's not actually what teenagers need to read now or want to read
Mm.
now. And it's also a bit disingenuous focusing on the suffering of gay white men when we have so much anti-trans rubbish at the moment, and it feels like we're putting the spotlight on the wrong thing.
Yeah.
So it's a very long-winded answer to your question, but it was just basically like it just it isn't the right time for the story that I was writing, and you know, it wasn't as good as it could have been if it was fiction. And the two things that I answer to are to the story and to the audience. And so this was a way I could package those ideas and examine how much has changed about being queer in Australia in a pretty short amount of time, but also repackaging it to be the kind of queer story that I haven't really read before, or that, if I have read it, I haven't read much of it. And so I didn't want to retread things that I'd done before in my own work or that I'd read done before in other people's work.
Yeah, thank you. That's all so interesting. Just to pick up on something you've said. So obviously
Mhm.
the thing that sets young adult fiction apart is that you're writing specifically for teenagers. And it's so interesting to
Mhm.
hear about the thought process that you have behind thinking about, oh, what do these teenagers actually want to read? What's their perspective on the issues and what's happening today? So yeah, how exactly do you I guess stay in touch with what teenagers are thinking about and caring about today?
I mean, the dirty secret is we're not actually writing for teenagers. We're writing for people in their mid-20s and mid-30s who have jobs and are buying books, but, either because of Harry
Anyone can
Potter
read
or some
YA.
other
This is
reason,
true.
yeah, have hit a ceiling and like, this is the level of complexity I like in my novels. And it's like, we're in this weird space now where I'm reading YA books where I'm like, this is about a 30-year-old protagonist, but you've just changed their age to 16. And so there's that which I'm sort of resistant to. But the other thing is, like, in terms of how do I make sure my work still speaks to teenagers, it's making sure I'm out there. A big part of being an author in Australia is that even a really, really, really best-selling book that's Australian YA will sell in its lifetime between 7 and 10,000 copies. which, that will translate to between 14 and, $20,000. That is not enough to live on. And the fact that we get paid 6 months after a sale, it's like that's not enough to last on for a year, let alone longer. Um, so the big part of living as a YA author in Australia is doing school visits. That's great because that connects me with my audience, conducting writing workshops, chatting to teens. And I know when I'm speaking to teens, within 5 minutes, you know if you've lost them.
Yeah.
And so, that's helped me sort of stay current, stay present. And I think that is another reason why I shifted to memoir in the pandemic, because I lost that connection with my audience. And so it was very much like, okay, I'm literally just writing for me. And that's when writing became therapeutic and it became a diary. And then, sort of as we were coming out of lockdown, I was just looking at, those pages and pages going, oh my God, who is this for? Um, so yeah, I think keeping engaged with booksellers, with teens at events at festivals and schools, that is what keeps my writing sort of relevant. But, there's the other side of that is it was very easy for me as a 17, 18, 19-year-old author to be like, what do teens want? Okay, what do I want? Now that I'm in my early 30s, it's a completely different kettle of fish. And I find myself relating to the adults as well and what their experience would have been as teenagers, because they're getting closer to my age and their cultural touchstones and my cultural touchstones. And so that's a lot of We Could Be Something is poking fun at that as well, but it's something that I know I'm coming towards at quite a quick pace. And so I'm wrestling with, is this my last YA novel? Like, do I have it in me to keep doing this? Because no one likes a 50-year-old dressing like Steve Buscemi being like, hey, fellow kids, like at some point, I have to make room for the 17, 18, 19-year-old authors like me, the 25, 26-year-olds who, have something fresh to say to teenagers, because, I can work really, really hard to connect with them. But at some point, hopefully not soon, um, I think that gap will be too wide. So I'm wrestling with that. I'm sad for if that day comes, but at the moment, I'm just hoping that it never does.
Yeah, I mean, I hope you keep writing YA books, though I guess if you stop writing YA, hopefully you'll keep writing something else and I'll get to read that instead.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, you have written several other books, and you've
hmm
written fantasy as well as realist stories.
hmm
So what draws you to wanting to write realist stories and choosing that for this book?
So I think contemporary realism is where I'm most at home. Like, if you say, Will, you have to write a story about two people who are pretty boring and nothing happens for 50 pages, I can make that the most interesting story you've ever read. If you tell me, Will, here are 50 of the most engaging, plot points, and there's this betrayal and there's twists and there's sexual tension and all that sort of stuff, go away and write that. I am terrible at it. I can't do it. Like, when things happen in a book, I'm like, no, I'm out. This is too difficult. I can't. I find that as a writer, I become very much like, oh, this character moved, a fraction to the left and moved their arm up here. I get into the mechanics of human behavior rather than the soul of a story. Um, so yeah, this book was never going to be a fantasy. And obviously, after as much as I loved writing the Monuments duology, and as much as that was a sort of reset for me, and in sort of, you know, refilled my cup, and it made me hungry again to sort of write realism. Like, I know you really shouldn't write to sort of reaction, but Rebel Gods was released during the pandemic, and that was not my most successful book, let's just say that. And it was also just, there was a resistance where, especially booksellers and librarians, like, Will, we love you, we love your voice, but we don't want you to write fantasy. I'm like, did you read the fantasy? It was mostly what I write before, just with some funny fantasy stuff happening in the background. And there was just a resistance to letting me explore different genres, which I totally understand. Like every time Terry Pratchett wouldn't write a Discworld novel, I would get so pissed off with him. I'm like, what are you doing? You are wasting your time and you are wasting my time. Give me Granny Weatherwax. Um, because that's, whether we like it or not as readers, we love it when authors write the same thing over and over again. Um, but I never just want to write the same thing for the sake of it. And so, writing the fantasy gave me time off to sit there and go, okay, what do I want to write next in one of my equally serious books, but one that someone will take a lot more seriously. And so going back to themes of family, exploring my queerness on the page, things like that, like that's the sort of stuff that makes me happy. And I could never have written this book had I not written the fantasy books, which, were the first books that I wrote after the coming out debacle of 2016 that made me more comfortable exploring queer themes on the page, that, um, allowed me to experiment with different writing styles and things like that, and ultimately made me a better writer. So, like, I could have had this idea immediately after the sidekicks. I don't think this would be the shape of the novel, or it would be half as successful had I not, dabbled in fantasy and let myself have that break to recharge and have a bit of fun.
Yeah, I mean, I loved Monuments. It's up there on my bookshelf somewhere, so I'm very glad that you wrote it. But I love that
Yeah.
idea, the fact that everything that we write kind of leads us to what we write today. I think that's a really nice thought. So thank you so much for chatting with me today. I hope everyone enjoys We Could Be Something. Thank you so much, Will.
Thank you so much. It was a delight.